Hello, listeners and viewers. I'm AJ Fisher, creator of the HYPOXiX method, and your host for today. I am unbelievably excited today to have with us our guest, Dr. Jaap Verbaas. Welcome, and thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Jaap Verbaas. He is an unbelievable individual. He is an exploration geologist with a PhD from Simon Fraser University. He is the founder and CEO of Cavu Energy, that's CAVU Energy Metals, a copper exploration company, which was recently acquired by Alpha Copper. Not only has he explored Australia, Northern Africa, and Canada in his geological expeditions, but he has applied his brilliant mind to bettering land-based training protocols for freedivers, stemming from his own passion for freediving. His scientific mindset has encouraged him to more deeply explore potentially beneficial land-based training protocols for freedivers. The scientific need to have a clear understanding of the inner workings of not only exercise science, but also respiratory physiology with a focus in the area of breath holds has led him to the publication of the book Longer and Deeper and the blog Freedive Wire, which both cover freediving science and training. I mean, are you guys impressed? This is really, I'm so grateful, and I cannot wait to dive into so many questions with you. After I finished my graduate work and I focused on breath work and also altitude training, of course, me thinking that I was the inventor of using breath work to create hypoxia in the body. I mean, how naive, right? I'm sure you've had moments like this before where you're like, wow, I think that I've discovered the thing that's going to win me the next Nobel Prize. Not that I thought that, but you can think that because you have that background. But of course, I have these amazing epiphanies and think this is unbelievable. Is anyone else in the world doing this? Who else is using hypoxic breathing? Who's using increases in carbon dioxide in the body to achieve performance enhancement and health and longevity? And you were one of the names that that kept popping up when I was doing the research. And then I read your book Hypoxic Squats, and I went through those training protocols, and I just found it so fascinating that you were also looking at so many different elements like myoglobin in the body and looking at lowering of blood oxygen and so many things. And so basically, I think the first thing I want to ask you is, when I read that first book of yours, and I still need to read Longer and Deeper, and I cannot wait to read that book, I was just so fascinated with your fascination with that type of training. And I know that it stems from your passion for freediving, and also you have this incredible exploratory scientific mind. And so you applied your background as a geologist and as a scientist to exploring and questioning land-based training protocols for freedivers. I just found that so fascinating. And so could you just tell me a little bit about what was the aha moment, and what really motivated you to create those training protocols, those land-based training protocols for freedivers, and then also tell me about the importance of myoglobin and why you started measuring your myoglobin. I'm just so fascinated in all of that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it's as these things go, it was a passion project that went wild, of course. But where it came from really is what I thought was a lack of understanding towards what might work in terms of land-based training. And so I live in a place, Vancouver, Canada, where the diving is great, but it's very cold, and so there's not a chance that we can spend 8 hours in the water and train. We can manage 1-2 hour dive sessions at most, and then we just become too cold. So a lot of the training has to be done on land. And so I started going down the rabbit hole trying to figure out, what actually happens during a breath hold in muscles, right? It's very different than any other exercise in that you stop breathing, period, right? So CO2 just increases and increases while your oxygen is depleted. But the most important thing that happens is that the arterioles constrict, and so blood flow to the exercising muscles is reduced on top of all the other changes. And so starting with that, knowing that bloodborne oxygen is reduced during a dive, that means This goes into myoglobin, that myoglobin becomes a potentially important oxygen reservoir. On top of that, we know that many diving mammals have big reservoirs of oxygen in myoglobin. It's a little different in the way the protein. It's a slightly different type of myoglobin, but still, there's a correlation. On top of that, elite cyclists have bigger reservoirs of myoglobin than untrained people, right? So there's clearly an effect that you can have on the myoglobin that's stored in muscles. So what I tried to do was I tried to design an exercise, and this is specifically for those hypoxic squats, which are detailed in longer and deeper. I tried to design an exercise that would cause the muscles in the legs, which are the main diving muscles, to be derived of oxygen to a point that there would have to be a physiological response to the oxygen depletion. And so that's what resulted in the hypoxic squats in the book. So it's got 3 phases. One of these squats, as you know, an exhale breath hold while sitting or lying down on the bed. And then while you keep holding your breath, you get up into an isostatic squat. The goal there is to cause the arterioles to restrict before doing the squat, and then maintaining that squat for a period of time that will allow your overall, usually I measured SpO2 to see whether, and I correlated that to muscle oxygen with a MOXIE sensor. But I wrote it up in a way that anybody can use a SpO2 measurement in order to do the training. You hold the squat, sit back down, record your lowest SpO2, and usually aim for this between 70 and 85%, depending on where you're at with your training and how much you are willing to suffer.
70% in conjunction with those squats. I mean, that's pain. That's no joke. I mean, you're feeling that lactate, you're feeling the carbon dioxide, especially if you're not adapted. I mean, that's intense.
Yeah, no, I think a good place to start for a lot of people would be 80 or 85, and I've gone as low as 65 and 60, and it just becomes counter effective because you end up being sore for 2 or 3 days, and it's not exactly a lot of fun. Plus, it makes it a little more dangerous because you could just keel over if one goes a little bit wrong. And then the exercises are also done in similar to your HYPOXiX work. It's done in a repetitive way, so you do 8 to 12 repetitions, which effectively stimulates, you going down for a dive 8 to 12 times in a row and going through that high SpO2 to low SpO2 phase, essentially. And so I haven't actually measured myoglobin in the muscles before and after, but I've been able to measure an increase in the amount of time that I was able to hold these squats and a decrease in and I was able to maintain the squat at the same time, and my SpO2 was higher at the end of it, by the end of the training protocol. So there is an adaptation. I can't say for 100% with 100% certainty that it is myoglobin that does it. It could be something else, but I think, looking at the theory, that is probably the response.
Well, I mean, that also must drive you crazy a little bit as a scientist, not knowing for sure, and because that the myoglobin was the incentive in the first place, kind of. I mean, you had this thought. Mm-hmm. I wonder if the myoglobin is going to increase, and just tell everyone why potentially it would be beneficial to increase your myoglobin.
As a diver, well, the problem we run into with a dive, let's say you do a 50-meter dive or a 150-foot dive, right, and you go straight down and up. There's so much the constriction of those blood vessels, you feel it very quickly, and so you're really only relying on the oxygen in the blood in your legs and in the myoglobin in your legs, say the quads, to bring you down and up. And there's just if there's not a lot of it, you will generate very high lactate levels very quickly, and it can become so fatiguing that you end up being at half your depth going back up, and it's just too strenuous, right? So some divers have complained about almost full on muscle failure during these kind of dives, which is it's not comfortable, and it's kind of scary, of course. So,
oh, absolutely. I mean, it's right. Then it becomes extremely dangerous. And for just the average exerciser who might be using a protocol, even just simply slowing the breathing down, which may or may not increase myoglobin. Of course, we don't know. This is a future study that needs to be done. This also could be beneficial for a land-based exerciser, because just having those increased that increased density of myoglobin could also help to increase the that fatigue threshold, or reduce the amount of lactate that's spiking earlier on in exercise.
Yeah, and so I guess maybe it's a good idea to tell people what myoglobin is actually used for, and if you're not freediving, it's actually the protein that brings oxygen from the red blood cells into the mitochondria, where the energy is produced in the blood. And so it's like blood, it is something that transports oxygen as well as stores it. And for freedivers, I mean, we want to increase the oxygen storage, right? When we go down, that's why the lung stretches, and anything we can do to bring more oxygen down with us tends to help.
Absolutely. And so that myoglobin, ultimately, the theory is that the myoglobin would increase because there isn't as much oxygen available. And so therefore the myoglobin would increase to increase the storage of oxygen in the muscle, so that the muscle, similar to like glycogen storage in muscle, or in some senses it can parallel hemoglobin, which is the protein that carries oxygen through the blood, not into the muscle. Yes. Yeah. So it's really, really interesting. And I love that you detailed that cyclic, or those repeated cycles into hypoxia, to see if, with that repeated exposure, meaning simply repeating sets of exercises or repeating repetitions with the breath holds, if that was enough of a stressor, a good stressor for the body to achieve an adaptation. Now, you did see an adaptation over a certain period of time, because you saw that your body was adapting, in that the blood oxygen wasn't lowering as much by the time you finished the protocol. And about how long did that take?
I think it was about 6 weeks where I could clearly say, in my N-1 experiment, that there was an effect. Yeah.
Absolutely. And for those of you who don't know what N-1 is, that just means that he was the only person in his study. He was a case study. He was doing a case study on himself. And he is a scientist, so he was highly, highly detailed. But of course, we do need more research in this area. There's there's little to none. Do you know of any larger research papers that have been, or studies that have been done looking at myoglobin and breath work or free diving?
To be honest, I've kept up with the research a little less since I've published my book, but I don't think there is. I haven't seen it, I guess I should say. So, I mean, the one downside, of course, or the one tricky part of research to myoglobin is that it takes muscle biopsies, right? And anything else you can do are proxies, and so it's that's one of the downsides. It just makes the research very expensive. The next downside is that freedivers, there's just not that many of us yet. It's a growing sport, but there's lots of research towards cycling and running and those kind of things. But in terms of freediving, it's a little less. So it'll take some time.
Absolutely. And what about the moximeter? I almost bought one when I finished reading that book, because I was so curious, and I'm like, oh, it's an end of year tax write-off. I totally should. I was going to my husband like, okay, now this year I'm going to buy a capnometer and a moximeter. He's like, wait, and just make sure that you're going to spend a lot of time with that. And I was so inspired by you. I ended up not buying one because I was starting my online business at the time, and just so many things. But it's how accurate do you believe the moximeter or moximeter, however you pronounce it, to be?
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, I saw a high correlation with just the general pulse oximetry. And of course, the Moxie has a different, so it's a near infrared sensor, which means similar to a pulse oximeter. It shines light into your tissues, and the refractory light or the color of that light is measured. The tricky part with a Moxie is that you're looking at a combination of blood-borne oxygen as well as myoglobin depletion. And so you have to look at both of them and say, well, okay, if my muscle oximetry is at, say, 20%, then, and oxygen depletes first, or sorry, hemoglobin depletes first, then, I'm probably at 5% hemoglobin total saturation and, so many percent myoglobin total saturation. So you're making an assumption on, first of all, on the total amount stored in hemoglobin versus myoglobin in your muscle, and second, on how much is actually, what the ratio of depletion is. And that kind of, it's hard to get to the perfect number. But
oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, so you're making that correlation between between the two. Like, if you're going to make a ratio between myoglobin and hemoglobin, about if you have this percent change here, then we should have this percent change here.
Exactly,
I get it.
yeah.
I mean, muscle biopsies are really painful and they are expensive. Not many people want to get a slice of their muscle taken out of their body to, it's. I mean, it hurts.
I was grad student when I wrote, or I think it was just after I finished my PhD that I finalized the book. But when I was in the last year of graduate studies, I mean, it tends to be pretty expensive time of life, right? Or at least not a time in my life that I was making a lot of money. So I would have probably been crazy enough otherwise to just have it done on myself. But I didn't.
Oh, totally. I mean, this is why most studies are full of, of undergraduate and graduate students who will just do anything. Will do anything, to make some extra money, and and they also have the time, to participate in the research that's happening 3, 4, or 5 times a week.
Yeah. To your point though, on the Moxie, like it's, I think the sensor is very good, and it at least in me, it created reproducible results over time, and I was able to use it. It does add an extra element of, I mean, I rented one from a local exercise facility, and so that's how I got around the cost of buying one.
That makes sense. I'm looking to rent a capnometer, but I don't know if renting one is a good idea. I mean, I'm so curious about, and for those of you who don't know what a capnometer is, and I'm so sorry this is getting so nerdy, but all of this stuff is so exciting. Capnometer is ultimately a device that measures your carbon dioxide, in your breath. And so you can see shifts in your carbon dioxide when you're breathing in certain ways, whether you are, hyperventilating or hypoventilating. And you can actually see pretty big shifts in your carbon dioxide. And, we're about to talk a little bit more about that. And the benefits of, hypercapnia is increased carbon dioxide levels in your blood when you're training. And I'm sure that, Jaap, you've experienced that quite a bit as a free diver, and of course because you're holding your breath for long periods of time and you're feeling that those carbon dioxide levels rising in your body. So now we've gone over myoglobin, so now let's switch to carbon dioxide. And so this is also something that you can train with, and of course you felt that severe hypercapnia when you were holding your breath and performing, and you felt that also when performing my workout that I sent you with those long, resisted exhales, like getting to low lung volume, meaning blowing the air out of your lungs and then doing a breath hold on an exhalation. And so how did freedivers deal with that, with those feelings of carbon dioxide in the system? And what are other training methods that you use to help increase that, that carbon dioxide threshold, or that feeling, that trigger that you get when the carbon dioxide levels are at a certain point that are very uncomfortable?
Yeah. So what happens when during a free dive is that we don't have any sensors, or not really any useful sensors in the body for O2. It's all CO2 related. So it's the high level of CO2 that will actually cause an urge to breathe, right? And So a lot of freediving training is breath tables and exercise that actually is purely focused towards being able to tolerate higher CO2 levels, so that you're able to either resist or postpone the urge to breathe. And so there's a few ways to do that. In my book, I had, the training mask is one of the things I wrote about. I later learned that you might as well just breathe through your nose while you're running, because it kind of does the same thing.
Right.
It's a little harder. It's easier to cheat, but that's a great way to make sure that you're doing something at a higher with a higher level of CO2 in the body, and you will get used to that. But most freedivers start by doing tables, so consecutive breath holds that are longer and longer, or consecutive breath holds that are have less and less of a recovery in between, so that the baseline CO2 level increases at the start of one of those breath holds. So those are some. I mean, I think it's important. One of the things that you'll find a lot of myths about in freediving, if you look, online or in different resources, is the idea of increasing your breathing rate before a dive, which it purges CO2 from the system, right? It actually removes CO2. Problem with that is that higher CO2 levels also allow hemoglobin to release the oxygen from the blood cells. And so by trying to hyperventilate before a free dive, you actually increase your chances of blackout, which is a low risk because it doesn't happen so often, but extremely high stake, because if it happens, the chances of death are high, right? So that's one thing that you're actually better off being able to tolerate higher CO2 levels than trying to start with less.
Absolutely. I think this is really fascinating what you're saying about the hemoglobin actually offloading the oxygen, and then the muscles being able to use the oxygen, and it's safer. I think about, and I've been studying breathing a lot the past couple of years. I became very obsessed with it at an undergraduate level, and then when I started going into my graduate classes, I was determined to write as many papers as I could on respiratory physiology and breath work, and even popular breath work that's happening in the world right now. And I became really fascinated with studying the mechanics of the Wim Hof method, and also the oxygen advantage method.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've heard of both of them, and so it's so fascinating looking at the two of them. And so it's interesting. I didn't know that about freedivers, but it makes sense that they would attempt that more Wim Hof style of, I can hold my breath for longer if I hyperventilate and then hold my breath, because I'm not going to get that, that carbon dioxide trigger. But I can't tell you how many people I know who have passed out when performing that hyperventilation, and then going into an exercise and breath holding versus breath holding on an exhale, on hypoventilation. And for those of you who don't know what hypoventilation is slowing the breathing down. Hyperventilation is quickening the breath faster than normal. And so it's really interesting that of course that would be used as a safety protocol before going underwater. Do not hyperventilate, because you're at risk of passing out.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And that's a reason to improve that carbon dioxide tolerance.
Totally.
So that is, it's really, really interesting. And do you know of other benefits to training with carbon dioxide in the system outside of just being able to perform with carbon dioxide in the system? I know that you're training yourself to have more endurance and be able to perform more work with carbon dioxide in your system. And so of course you would always have that in your training protocol, or any freediver, because it's your sport to have to hold your breath for a long period of time while you're underwater, so you don't want to be as triggered by carbon dioxide. But what about the general population exerciser who wants to include some hypercapnic training? And we were talking a little bit earlier about this, but I would love to hear your more of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's very hard to know what the exact benefits would be I don't have a straightforward answer, but what I do know is that, or believe is that, for example, Buteyko breathing, right, is purely a seated exercise, breathing through extra resistance. All it does is increasing, and it's been beneficial for many people, and for all sorts of reasons too. So I don't, and this is going to be all speculation, but maybe it is something to do with if you tolerate, you do these exercises now and then your baseline CO2 level goes up because your baseline ventilation rate goes down. Maybe the tissues that are less perfused with blood, etc., are actually able to use more oxygen just because there is more CO2 in the system and it offloads in those places as well. I don't know if that's the case. I think it could be.
It's a really good speculation. These are areas I've also speculated into as well, because I've been training clients for years, and I've always had some level of breathing, breath work, controlled breathing in conjunction with their exercise. I've been doing this for 10 years. Back when I was certified as a Pilates instructor, the Joseph Pilates method is one of the pillars is the breath work and the controlled breathing. But I wouldn't say that the breathing is necessarily slowed down, and even in most pranayama practices, just because you're controlling your breathing doesn't mean that you're increasing your carbon dioxide. And so I became really fascinated by Xavier Warren's work. If you know the French physiologist who has done a lot of work on hypoventilation and breath holds at low lung volume with his athletes, and looking at the improved muscle buffering capacity to tolerate lactate, and also the ability to improve performance by performing these long exhalations in these breath holds in conjunction with exercise. And so I think I became really fascinated with the slowing of the breath down. And so about a year and a half ago, I started training with a very, very specific tempo and frequency and intensity of breath. And that's the workout that I sent you, that level 8 breathography, which is, it's just
pretty hard.
It's not as intense. It's not as intense as, the hypoxic squats and holding the breath for, 30 seconds and maybe even longer. And I do gradually progress clients up to that point. They're only starting with an 8-second exhalation so that their body can adapt to it over time. And they also see what you saw at the end of hypoxic squats, which is, that adaptation and the blood oxygen, where their blood oxygen doesn't fall as much, and they're just sitting in 85%, and they're staying there for even most of the workout because of that cyclic breathing. And, I've over the past year and a half since I've been doing the online training protocols, and I've been training larger groups of individuals, I've been able to make certain observations, and there are many people who submit their data to me just, informally, of course. I do have a formal study running, but the informal data is interesting just to look at everyone's blood oxygen, positive effects that people are experiencing. And just like Buteyko breathing, I don't know exactly what it's due to. Is it due to some level of adaptation to performing hypoxic breathing, which I have documented 3 or 4 times a week, and the increases in HIF1, which for those of you who don't know that's hypoxia inducible factor in the system that increases growth factors and increases red blood cells and all these things in the system, or is it due to the 3 or 4 times a week repetitive for 30 minutes at a time exposing their bodies to higher level of carbon dioxide levels, which certainly is improving their CO2 tolerance. In fact, we do a carbon dioxide tolerance test once every 4 or 6 weeks, and everyone hands down always sees that drastic improvements. Sometimes even up to 100 or 200% increase in duration of time. And some of the things that we've seen with the breath work in conjunction with exercise, and I think that's what I'm most interested in, is people have been experiencing improvements in their performance, and also improvements in GI, which I think that probably has more to do with the autonomic nervous system and just getting into a pattern of slowed ventilation, and possibly, and again, I know we're speculating a bit, but there is research to support that slowed breathing and improvements in that parasympathetic and sympathetic relationship can also help the GI tract. And then also, interestingly, I've also seen, and anecdotally, these results have come into me, improvements in body composition and reductions in fat in certain areas that individuals have otherwise had a hard time, with before. And of course, I'm a personal trainer, so I'm always dealing with how do we burn the fat? How do we burn the fat? Mm-hmm. And so I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on this, because and I know I think I phrased this incorrectly at first. I asked you, why would potentially there be an increased rate of fat burn with hypoventilation and breath holds in conjunction with exercise? But I didn't mean increased fatty acid oxidation or fat burn during exercise. I mean as a consequence over time, as a positive result, meaning it could be more carbohydrates burned during exercise, but I've witnessed this. I've gotten this feedback enough that it's significant, informally enough to have a conversation about.
Yeah. Right on. Yeah. I mean, I'll take it back to, I guess, my experience with when I was experimenting with different diets and free diving, etc. And what I noticed is that I personally do well on high fat diets, ketogenic diet, etc. And what I've noticed is initially I tried to use keto because you produce less CO2 over time. To see if I could, hold my breath longer and dive more comfortable. And of course, there's two reasons for this. One is freedivers usually like to dive in a fasted state because there's less oxygen going to digestion. It's also, if you're upside down in the water and you have a full stomach, it can get kind of uncomfortable. So that's part of it. The other part was, well, potentially we produce less CO2. Let's try if I can hold my breath for longer on keto or with a delayed onset of the urge to breathe. And so, long story short, I could. There was a delayed onset. I think at the height of it, it's at 3 millimole of ketones in my blood. If I was around that level, I could almost, without a warm up, do a 4-minute exhale breath hold. And that's like the only time I've ever been able to do that is in ketosis.
And out of curiosity, what was it before that, to have a comparison?
It was less than 3 minutes, quite a bit less than 3 minutes. So it was a big change.
Like 33%. I mean, that's huge.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it was a big difference. And I noticed it a lot in the diving itself as well. I was just much more comfortable, and I could go, I regularly did 30, 40 meter dives with basically no urge to breathe at all. Like going, being under for 2.5 minutes or so. So that's, 90 or 120 feet ish. It was very relaxing, a very relaxing way of diving. But what I noticed after that is, after I had done these, had been in ketosis for a while, is that the change in going from a non-keto state to a keto state was much quicker. So the first time I tried this was probably well before I started free diving. I kind of got interested in seeing, do I feel better on different diets, this and that. I tried to go into ketosis when I think I was 28, and I just couldn't do it for like 2 weeks. I tried and I didn't get there. It was frustrating and it felt bad, right? Just because it's quite a strict diet and you have to measure your blood ketone level, otherwise it's just hard to get it right. And then when I finally got it 2 or 3 tries later, took me less long. But then right now, if I can be in mild ketosis within 24 hours of my latest very carby meal, and which is quite quick. And I notice, because I go out for a dive. I mean, I don't eat breakfast. I'll just, I might have a salt pill, the same kind of thing that ultra runners would use to keep their electrolyte balance up. Still drink water, of course, and go dive. And by the end, if I get out of the water at 2-3 p.m., I'll be at somewhere between 0.3 to 0.7 millimoles of ketones. And so what is it in this case? Does the breathing have anything to do with it? Is it purely fasting? I'm not sure, but I don't know how this correlates with what you've seen, right? I really don't know for sure, but I think I think what there's a threshold, right? Between if you do low intensity exercise, usually you're burning free fatty acids rather than sugars. And at a certain threshold of VO2 max, you start going into more burning through glycogen. Maybe by doing it slightly hypoxic and hypercapnic, you lower that threshold and you allow people to burn through their glycogen faster, forcing them to use a different substrate.
Absolutely. I think this is also what I mean. This was my theory, and also looking at like Xavier Warren's research and looking at how much more quickly we get into our anaerobic metabolism at a lower intensity of exercise, it would make sense that we would potentially deplete our glycogen. And for those of you who don't know what glycogen is, it's just our stored form of carbohydrate. And some individuals may have more success with their long-term fat loss if they can adequately deplete their glycogen when they exercise, because then they can get to burning the fat. I'm being like way overly simplistic, but if you view it this way, if you burn through your muscle glycogen and you don't have any more glycogen or carbohydrates in your system to burn, then you're gonna be burning fat, and potentially maybe there's a greater post-exercise burn, fat burn, because you've also gone through that intensity, that anaerobic metabolism, or that metabolism where you're burning more sugars, more carbohydrates for fuel, versus the fatty acids for fuel, which I know it doesn't, to the listener who doesn't understand exercise physiology, it may seem counterintuitive. You'd think, oh, well, the harder I work, the more fat I burn, but really you're burning the highest percentage of fat when you're sleeping, when your body is least active, but because the total amount of calories that you're burning is at such a slow, as that's at such a low rate, then even though it's, almost 100% fatty acid burn, you're still not really burning that much fat, and so I think especially for those who have suffered with or suffer with diabetes, blood glucose dysregulation, it potentially can be a method of regulating blood sugar, because to get to a place where you're exercising that glucose metabolism, you're exercising that the anaerobic metabolism, and and depleting your glycogen, there is that potential there that that there could be an improvement in long-term fat loss, at a lower intensity of exercise. And many people who suffer with, blood sugar dysregulation or, diabetes, may have a tendency to have a higher body weight and have a harder time exercising with as much intensity as they might need to see positive effects from exercise. So I've worked with a lot of individuals in the past who have had low back pain or have dealt with obesity. And so I'm always curious to experiment and like figure out exercise hacks for those individuals who may not be able to absorb the impact or the compression or the forces on their body that an elite athlete would. So I'm very interested in in this research in the area of altitude training, and also breath training and hypercapnic training, in terms of not necessarily for the elite athlete. I mean, I love elite athletes, but my, the clients who I tend to train, and even my online programs, are for the, the general population exerciser who just wants to, some kind of an interesting exercise hack that's going to, to benefit them more, whether it's injury prevention or, greater amounts of fat loss, or not having to work as hard to get great results, and we've been trying to figure this out for, how many decades now, ever since exercise became obsessive in the not only the American culture but the world, but especially here, it's just Americans are known for like gotta high intensity exercising 4 or 5 times a week, gotta get the results.
and I think breathing should be an integral part of it, but for some reason it isn't, right? It's like it's seen as something that just happens automatically, but I think breathing, right? We know it doesn't, just from the way that stressed people tend to breathe very shallow, right? It's like something that you control. And anyway, going back to I think you're when I was doing the ketogenic diet and recording all my exercise, etc., what I did notice was as well, I can still eat carbs. I just have to kind of plan my exercise for it, because if I were to do a weightlifting session and deplete that glycogen, I can handle quite a bit more while still staying in ketosis. So there's definitely a glycemic index control on, that you have by training a certain way. Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's really interesting. And I think what turned me on to the again, I know I'm obsessed with this French physiologist, Xavier Morans, but I think it was really his, decades of 2 decades, I think, of research where in his lab he focuses on hypoxic breathing and the extended exhalations. And I was just so excited that a scientist was devoting his entire lab to this, and he found it worthy enough to spend that much time on it. And so I think that it was really, for myself, it was the initial obsession with altitude training and hypoxic training, not necessarily for elite athletes, because we know that elite athletes use altitude training to increase their red blood cells to get performance enhancement. I mean, I know it's a little it's controversial. People are on the fence as to whether or not it really does enhance performance, just based on not being able to push as much as as much as you can when you're at sea level. But I became so interested in the therapeutic benefits for individuals who were trying to prevent disease or ameliorate the disease that they had. And and so when I started reading about diabetic patients who would use, and there's a ton of research, and I mean the Russians have been doing research and altitude, starting with hypobaric chambers and altitude chambers, for like decades and decades. I mean, ever since the 1940s, 1950s. And so, I started reading this research on blood glucose regulation and exposure by going into a hypobaric chamber, and even just resting in the chamber, not even necessarily exercising. And that was a huge aha moment for me, thinking, wow, this is really incredible that someone can improve their blood glucose response, as a diabetic patient, by exposing themselves to this, this hypoxic environment. And so when that segued into looking at Xavier Warren's work and looking at the breath work inducing hypoxia, and him also seeing, improvement, anaerobic metabolism and then improvements in blood glucose, and, thinking, wow, well, there must be a correlation, and clearly breath work is effective at creating these short-term and sometimes even long-term effects. And so I just think it's so interesting that you can expose yourself to these environments. And of course, I still wonder, well, is it the hypoxic? Is it the hypoxia? Yeah. Is it the rise in carbon dioxide? I mean, there's so many things that are happening when you expose yourself to altitude, and also when you perform the breath work. Now, the difference is you do get more of a rise in in carbon dioxide in your body when you're performing a breath hold or an extended exhalation to achieve the hypoxic work. Versus being in an altitude chamber, which sometimes you might even start hyperventilating because the ventilation responds to that altitude. But I just think it's so incredibly fascinating that someone can perform this this breath work and have such a profound physiological and also metabolic change, improvement in their body by resting, and performing this breath work. Never mind then adding in some level of movement and seeing an improvement in these areas. And so I just think it's really fascinating. Have you ever done any altitude training?
I used to do a lot of mountaineering, but I wasn't at a stage in my life that I was that focused on the training that because it just the altitude training, if I were to go to the Alps back when I lived in Europe, I would just spend a few days at altitude and feel quite all right, traversing the glaciers and all that kind of stuff. I didn't really have that much of an issue being high up, and so it was never a focus to. Yeah, I just didn't record it with as much detail. I didn't try to, enhance my own performance that much because I didn't need to back then.
Oh, yeah, no, of course.
Yeah.
What I found so fascinating about your book is just looking at the cyclic hypoxia, and of course, you're looking at the myoglobin and looking at the positive effects of of breathing, of hypoxically breathing. I just I kept asking myself the question: does this cyclic dynamic breathing actually contribute to or mimic in any way the effects of altitude training? Now, of course, the blood oxygen is going like this versus it staying low for a long period of time. But it's interesting because I was just listening to a Huberman podcast, and he had, he had Dr. Jack Feldman on there, who's, he's a respiratory physiology professor. He's, he named the pre-Botzinger complex in the brain. I mean, he's just so accomplished, so amazing. And he said, he was like, I just don't know if you actually, because he's very fascinated in hypoxic training. And he said, I would have an 8% oxygen tank next to my desk when I'm grant writing, because I feel the cognitive benefits of hypoxic training. And I mean, I've witnessed this also as well. Many of my clients now have altitude chambers, and, I'm very persuasive about this because I'm so passionate about it. And I train a lot of elderly individuals. And so I've seen these amazing cognitive improvements in the, when adding in the altitude training and the hypoxic training in conjunction with the workouts. But, I thought it was really interesting. He said that. And then after, he said, he was asked about breath work inducing hypoxia. And he said, I just really don't think that breath work can bring the blood oxygen down to a level where it needs to be to see the positive adaptations that you would see when, being in in a hypoxic chamber or climbing the mountains. But I just wonder if he hasn't tried the right breath work, because as I was listening, I thought, I am performing a method and teaching a method right now that does safely get your blood oxygen levels down to a place. And I know someone else who has written a book on it. And there are, and it's becoming, I think it's becoming more popularized right now. And, a lot of people are doing this intermittent hypoxic breathing, and they're, and they're feeling the positive effects on the brain and the body. And so I think the reason I want to, and I'm the study that I'm performing right now, it's a pilot study. It's the first one, and we're hoping to keep going with this research for many, many years, and continue to get bigger grants so that we actually can study larger populations of people and just look at the benefits of using breathing protocols to create safe levels of hypoxia. And I think I'm passionate about it because I know of the positive benefits of actual, being in a hypoxic chamber or being in the mountains therapeutically. Yeah. And so I'm really trying to figure out an effective method of creating hypoxic breathing protocols that are safe. The blood oxygen is not going too low, by being very specific about the timing and the intensity and the frequency of the breathing, because I think methods like Wim Hof and even Buteyko, which I know is usually not that dramatic, not that extreme. And, like Patrick McCowan, and there's some other methods out there that talk about the benefits of hypoxic breathing. But there's never a way of really testing. I never see I never witness any of these methods asking for testing, or being that specific with the timing and the intensity of the breathing. And I think that's something that motivated me to go into this method, where I had a metronome on. It's the same exhale every time. It's the same length of, exhalation. It's the same length of breath hold. And it's also progressive over 8 weeks. And then you go back to the first one, because, it's stressful for the body. And so,
totally.
So what is your opinion on using breathing to create hypoxia on the body, and how that can mimic altitude training?
Yeah, I don't see why not. I mean, I think there's one exercise in my book, actually, which I can't remember what I called it, to be honest, but it involves being on an exercise bike, cycling at a consistent amount of watts, so consistent power output, and controlling your breathing rate to induce hypercapnia. But you can do it the same way, just purely for hypoxia, right? You can probably increase the power somewhat, and maybe use a slightly faster breathing rate. I don't see why you couldn't use it that way to be at say 85% SpO2 for half an hour. Why not, right? And if you can manage the hypercapnia that comes with it, then yeah, totally.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is exactly my feeling. I mean, I'm wondering why individuals haven't been doing this for, the past 20 years. It's uncomfortable. It's not, I wouldn't say it's when you're first starting with this exercise protocol, it's not a nice, gentle yoga class. It's, you feel the muscles burning sooner.
I thought what you sent me was incredibly hard.
You did?
To be honest.
Really?
Yeah.
It was hard for you. Wow, this is exciting.
And I think the difference is that I've always tried to start, right, by imitating the dive reflex. which is hard to do on land. And you have to start with a breath hold that is static. And then there's a recovery period after the breath hold. And so whereas for you, you're trying to focus on maintaining a certain rhythm and maintaining the low the hypoxia, right? And that
Yes.
so you're effectively trying to keep the blood flow going, whereas I'm trying to restrict it in my exercises. And I think that's the fundamental difference that just made me, like, it just felt so hard for me.
I'm sure. No, absolutely. I mean, I even know when you're practicing your O2 and your CO2 tables, there's always a certain amount of rest. And of course, and we do rest in between exercises, but it's a very, very short period of time. And most of the workouts are anywhere between 20 and 30 minutes. And like you said, my goal is to keep the body in some level of hypoxic state, which for most, and I've been informally testing this for the past about year and a half, and most people are staying between 80 and like 93 the almost the entire workout. And it's interesting. And I have had no reports of dizziness or discomfort. Yes. If someone jumps into the level 8 breathography where they're doing 10 and 12 beat breath holds in conjunction with the total body work, the one that I sent you was a little bit extreme. That's the one, that's the final 4 weeks of the research protocol that I'm doing right now.
And so you figured, well, he can probably do it.
I was like, oh, this is Dr. Jaap. No, he'll be fine. He wrote Hypoxic Squats. I'll send him level 8. So for those of you who don't know my method, basically it's circuit training. And this particular workout basically just used bands and body weight. So it's basically calisthenic work, endurance work, but in conjunction with the 8-second exhale where he's really draining his lungs of air. So even with just the 8-second exhale, you're going to feel those increases in carbon dioxide and the lower blood oxygen. And then after that, he's holding his breath for 10 seconds and sometimes 12 seconds in conjunction with a single leg squat or a plank or some plyometrics. And so it's challenging. And did you test your blood oxygen while you were doing that?
I did. The first time I did it, I think it was the full the side steps, and
yes.
I started realizing, like, I wrote this up in my book, right? I tried to get really low a few times and write down exactly what I felt, and it usually starts with my vision going kind of yellow on the sides, going to red, and then suddenly or slowly the curtains close. I was at the point where my vision starts getting kind of reddish, which I know correlates to, for me, somewhere between 60 and 70.
Oh, wow, really?
And that's where the oximeter dipped to. There's a little lag, so it came down there about 20 seconds. That was the first time when I thought, okay, this is probably not supposed to happen. I'm gonna abort. And so I did portions of it later on, and yes, by using slightly less repetitions, etc., or making the inhales a little bigger, the exhales shorter, I can control it in the way that I think you intend to.
Absolutely. I know. I just threw this at Dr. Jaap, like, he's experienced, he's going to be fine. But in general, of course, we have an 8-week cycle where in the first week they're only performing the 8-second exhales, and then they add in the breath retentions, and those 10 and 12 beat holds are generally assigned mostly to the core work and the work on the ground. And with the standing work and the in the online method, we're usually performing 6 or 8 beat breath retentions at the conclusion of the 8-second exhale, and that right there was designed for the research protocol so that we could see and observe how the blood oxygen was dropping and just the body composition observations and things like that over a 12-week protocol, actually. So thank you so much for doing that workout. I'm honored that it was so intense for you.
My pleasure. Yeah, no, it certainly was. It's quite and at the end of it, I mean, I was kind of surprised. I pushed myself a little too hard probably, because I thought, well, I should be able to do this, but I think it literally was. It was hard, and so
amazing.
Yeah.
Well, this is really exciting. Well, I would love to at some point just do a 15-20 minute podcast again and do some and do a little bit of training. I'll have you train me for 5-10 minutes. I'll train you for 5 or 10 minutes, and I'll give you maybe a level 4 breathography. So that's 4 and 6 beat breath retentions. I know, and I know that you're not performing hypoxic squats all the time right now, and so how much are you free diving right now?
Not too much right now. I actually have some issues with my ear and sinuses that are keeping me out of the water. So I also, since my book was published, I've had two daughters, and they
Oh,
keep me.
congratulations.
Thank you. They keep me very busy. As, the
Oh,
way
well,
that
that's
goes.
fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Jaap, for this interview. It was just really, really profound. I was so happy to dive deep into the mechanics of carbon dioxide and oxygen and potential fat burn and exercise. I know the listeners and viewers are so grateful for your time. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks. It was a pleasure.
Absolutely. Okay, until next time, I'm AJ Fisher. Come see what's new at HYPOXiX.fitness. That's HYPOXiX.fitness. Bye-bye, everyone, and keep on achieving inner altitude.